Well, today we have something a little bit special. We have my friend Roy Pfaltzgraff from Northeast Colorado. And Roy's one of those strange guys doing all kinds of soil health stuff without livestock or irrigation. So we're going to talk about that and a bunch more stuff. So welcome to Ranching Reboot, Mr. Roy.
Well, thanks, Brian. It's great to be on here. It's been good to get to know you through last couple of conferences and stuff, and kind of excited to share what I know and what my opinions are, because that and $5 will get you a cup of coffee someplace.
You can still find a good cup of coffee for $5.
I didn't say good, did I?
You said a cup.
Yep.
That's fair. I grinded brew my own at home. So
I understand.
I mean, a good cup of coffee. I don't even know what it costs anymore. There's a little kind of a local coffee chain called Scooters. They're pretty good. I would much rather support them than Starbucks. And then there's a couple other local coffee shops we hit every once in a while. But oftentimes we find ourselves in town pretty late in the day, and it's not a time of day I want to be drinking coffee.
See, I'm lucky caffeine doesn't really bother me, so I don't have that issue. But I recently, well, through one of the marketing things that I'm involved in, met a guy, and his last couple businesses have strictly been roasting coffee, and had a conversation with him about coffee, and then he's like, let's go to such and such a little coffee shop, and he's like, well, try this, and it's like, oh wow. I mean, they're talk about a totally different world, and you see what capitalism and mass marketing has crushed what good coffee really is.
Yeah, we drank Folgers and Maxwell House for so many years. We didn't know what good stuff actually tasted like.
Yeah, no, I totally agree.
How do you take your coffee? You take it black, or you put cream in it, or?
It depends upon the day. Sometimes a little bit of milk. Sometimes I'll usually put honey in it, because I got lots and lots of honey sitting around. But yeah, so well, and some days I'll make espresso and really bitter, nasty things like that. And then some days I want the latte with all the crap added that makes it sweet and all that stuff. So, variety, diversity, it's important.
We just go between different beans. Every morning it's like I put the same amount of coffee in the cup, the same amount of cream. We like real heavy cream from our friends with up at Born-Traegers when we can get it. When it's not when we can get it. We can always get it when we go there. It's getting enough that lasts long enough for a while. So we end up drinking a bunch of it from a big box store, but that's okay. We try to support our locals when we can. So tell me how we do soil health in Northeast Colorado without.
Well, I do it much differently than anybody else. And I've been told I do it much differently than anybody else outside of Northeast Colorado. Our operation, I farm with my parents and my wife. We're trying to bring my stepson in if I can get a couple things to go, but it's a highly diverse rotation. We have 2,200 acres of dry land, and when I say dry land, it no irrigation whatsoever, which I know some people struggle with. I've actually seen people mentally check out of my talks when they're like, well, so what is your irrigation schedule? And it's like, well, when the good Lord thinks it's time, well, we might get some rain. And so it can be really challenging with that. But we have a highly diverse rotation. We're this year, well, it was 10 crops. Now it's 11 crops, because I think I found some seed that I've been looking for. Last year was 14 crops. We've been as high as 18 crops, and rotated with the design based upon some research that I found out of USDA and ARS by Randy Anderson. He's retired now, but he was a he wrote tons and tons of paper and had some really good research that of course disappeared when he retired and hasn't been followed on. But it's, you know, we use that and then we try to add some other little flavors of stuff and doing different soil amendments. And I've got a really cool drill, and so my drill allows me to do stuff that most drills don't. And but in the end it's still just an air seeder. And that was my focus when I started doing the whole soil health thing. I got really annoyed with experts from North Dakota and Canada saying, well, this is what you need to do. And it's like, you don't live in Northeast Colorado. You don't know what it's like. I mean, last year we had 4.5 inches of rain, a precip, 4.5 inches of precip. The
Total?
previous year, total. And the previous year we had 22 inches, but it came between, it started with 9 1/3 inches on the 28th, going into the morning of the 29th of April, and it ended on the 15th of June. So
it probably went down the creek.
well, a lot of the neighbors went into our fields and soaked in.
Did they give you any of their topsoil too?
Oh, of course. And they also sent their weed seed and their nitrogen, because we've been fighting Palmer amaranth since then, and the Palmer is where the water ran, is where the worst of the Palmer is. Well, Palmer is responsive to nitrogen, to high nitrogen levels. Well, we don't use hardly any fertilizer. I mean, with our rotation, and that's, Randy's work was focusing on using rotation to reduce herbicides. Well, you can use the exact same thing to help reduce fertilizer usage. So we're down over 75% on the herbicides that we use and the fertilizers that we use. And I was talking to my dad yesterday about budgeting on some stuff, because we have a crop chart that we develop every year, and it's got 23 years of history on it. And he's like, so are you settled on where things are? And I'm like, I'm pretty good, but I said it really doesn't matter though, because most of the stuff gets 20 pounds of AMS and 20 pounds of 40 rock, which is a phosphorus. And that's it.
What's AMS for those that
AMS
don't know?
is ammonium sulfate. It's a form of nitrogen that carries, it almost has the same amount of sulfur in it as it does nitrogen. And our soils are really devoid in sulfur. And since they pulled sulfur out of diesel fuel, yeah, we don't have acid rain as much anymore, but we also don't get free sulfur. So that's why we've gone to that. And that really came from, I was invited to a organic grower day. I still have no clue how I got on their mailing list. I was the only conventional guy there, but these presenters started talking about stuff, and it's like, wow, these guys know way more than what I ever guessed that they did. And then it makes sense though, because they don't have chemistry to bail them out when they get into trouble. They have to be on top of it. Good ones, good organic farmers have to be on top of it from day one. Bad organic farmers, they could care less.
We can talk about some of them later.
Yes.
So are you worried about there being, you said you had seeds washing in from the neighbor Palmer amaranth, which I call pigweed, which makes the cows love it. It's super
Yes.
proteins, great stuff. But I can understand how it can be a problem in some crop fields, because it is a big tough stem, it's a big plant, and it's got a big thick root. So are you worried about like getting residual herbicide load from some of that soil washing in from the neighbors?
A little, but not too much. The reason is my neighbors aren't really creative, and so they pretty much use glyphosate Gramoxone, 2,4-D, and Banville. And those, they do affect some of our crops. If they're sprayed on the crop, it'll kill them, but it doesn't have a huge impact on the growth of that crop when it's in the soil. And our soils are healthy and very active. And what people don't realize is there's actually bacteria that have been identified that will eat those specific chemicals. And it's just like anybody's job. If you give them too much to eat, well, they can't do it all. And that's when you start getting problems. But if you give them a little bit, well, that they digest it and it disappears from the system. And that's the problem in the past, is everybody was dumping on, when I say dump on, it's not huge amounts, but it's still, if you use less, it's better, and it gives your microbes a chance to digest it all. And that's kind of what we wanted to move away from, was just the standard everyday thing, like all of our neighbors were doing. And our biggest two costs on the farm were fertilizer and herbicides. And so we wanted to reduce that, because if you don't spend money, it's a whole lot easier to be profitable. And so I'm not worried about something running off the field, off the neighbors, that will just wipe out, sterilize my soil. I'm more worried about the Palmer, to be honest with you, and the nitrogen, because Palmer's a pain to control, and that's one reason why we got our electro weeder, is we can't control Palmer and dry edible beans. So instead get a piece
an
of
electro weeder.
Yeah, it's the weedzapper.com is the website for it. Some guys in Missouri, it's a giant tractor mounted generator, 225,000 watts at 480. So it's putting out 323 amps. That feeds a 100 kVA transformer. And that transformer is about the size of a 30-gallon drum. I mean, it's huge. And that feeds an electrode bar that's mounted on the front of the tractor. And anything that touches that bar is dead. Something about 15,000 volts tends to shorten the life expectancy of stuff. And if you're not careful when you're zapping weeds with it, you can overamp it, and you can literally blow weeds in half. The problem is then the bottom part doesn't die. So it's cool to watch, but it's not effective. So you turn down the amperage a little bit, and it does a beautiful job in things like dry edible beans. We've done custom work in sugar beets and organic millet. We have a neighbor that's organic, and he needed some help on a millet field, and it's a beautiful thing. I love it. I always say that the regenerative practices that we use on our farm were designed that you don't need any special equipment. And then people look at it and go, you have a weed zapper. And it's like, yeah, I have a weed zapper because everything that we're doing is profitable enough that I get to go out and buy toys now. And, my toys shoot bolts of lightning into weeds. So it's all good.
Sorry, I was just sitting here like envisioning you like in a Zeus outfit out there riding around on your tractor zapping weeds with lightning bolts.
Yeah, not quite, but it is really cool to watch. And I know I've posted videos on our social media stuff. I probably should get some up on YouTube, because it's fun to watch. I mean, it's really cool and a little scary.
Just talk to our buddy Jay Young about YouTube. He's starting to get it figured out. I need to go take some pointers from him too.
Yeah. He's been pushing me, and of course my wife's like, you should do that, and It's like, I know what'll happen when I get started. Well, then it's going to be added on to all the other fun stuff that I get to do.
I know exactly how that feels.
And to be honest with you, I'm the laziest person you've ever met. And so that adding extra work just doesn't fit in with that. And people don't believe me, but if you ask my wife, she'll be like, oh yeah, he's lazy.
I don't mind like creating the content. A lot of times is the easy part. Like just doing this,
Yeah.
getting it ready for release. That's what I need help with. Like show notes, break it down into like segments. Like, we talked about this from 1545 to, 3118. That's what I need help with. And I just don't, I'll be honest, I don't have time to do it. So I don't. So it's just
Yeah.
minimum, minimum editing, minimum production, which is why, this podcast format, it kind of really suits me because I'm a little on the lazy side too.
Yeah.
So you were starting to talk about, Randy Anderson and managing nutrients and weed pressure with different crops and crop rotation. You said you have like 10 to 14 different, you've grown 10 to 14 different crops. He said, what, 10 so far, getting ready to do 11 for this year?
This year, the plan is currently 11. Last year was 14. A couple of years ago, we were as high as 18.
I'm just like, I'm trying to work this out in my head that, you've got 18 different crops on 2,200 acres. So, or, 10 on 2,200 acres. So your field size, like it seems like you do a lot of a bunch of little stuff.
Yeah. Well, our fields generally are either 80s or 160. So quarters or half quarters. And so there's not an equal amount of each thing. And that's part of the problem is figuring out, it's a bit of a shell game of, well, if these acres go here, well, then I'm short on this crop because I've got a contract for that, or and it's gotten to the point where I've told my parents, it's like, I'd be a lot better off if we had another 1,000 acres. It'd make my life a whole lot easier, but it really wouldn't, because I would just add more crops. Because that's the insanity that I work with. Now, the flip side of it is it actually makes farming easier, because before, when I took over the operation, we were in standard operation and we'd have 700 acres of wheat. Well, I can't harvest 700 acres of wheat by myself, so we would hire a custom cutter crew, and that's $40,000. And every time we go to the bank after harvest to borrow the money to cover the check, the banker would be like, well, this would be a really nice down payment on a combine. Well, yeah, but we can't cover 700 acres, with the manpower we have. So by doing all these different crops, the biggest crop that we have, well, camelina is our biggest this year. Because I was going after some extra bonuses in the contract. We're about 650 acres on camelina this year. But most of our crops are 160 to 200 acres. Some are as low as 40. We got one field that'll be 5 this year of something new that we're trying. And so in any given day, it's like, well, I need to go out and drill pinto beans. It's like, well, I got 40 acres of pinto beans this year with the air seeder I have. I'll be done in 5 hours, and that's what I have to do that day. And when it's time to harvest pinto beans, I can cut 40 acres in a day. And so it's not like I have like these week marathons that everything is absolutely slammed and we're pushing really hard to get stuff done and working late and getting up early. And that's super stressful, and it's really hard on people. And when people don't get enough sleep, when they're jerks, they become really big jerks. And I tend to be a bit of a jerk. So I prefer to stay away from that situation where I rip somebody a new one over some stupid little thing, and save those talks for times when they really deserve it. And it's something that's a matter of life and death. So, it actually kind of came to a head this last summer. My I got over to my folks, and I always go in the house first and, talk to my parents and kind of fill them in what's going on and this, that, and the other, and what strange phone calls I've had, and, what different marketing opportunities have popped out of the woodwork. And I come in one day and my mom's like, you're showing up here later and later. She goes, it's 10 o'clock and you just showed up. And I'm like, yeah. And she's like, and you know, 10, when the sun starts going down, you're already gone. And I said, yeah, but are we behind? She's like, no. She goes, I think we're actually a little bit ahead of where we usually are. And it's like, then why does it matter? Her father was up before dawn and he worked until dark, and he did that every day during the growing season. And of course, some of the time he was a snowbird, and they went down to Texas or Arizona for the winter. But when he was around for the winter, they had cattle you got to take care of. And I mean, it's a lot of work. And that's what she grew up seeing. And that's what she watched her husband do. And then her son comes loafing in at 10 o'clock in the morning and not in a big hurry. And, if I'm in the field by noon, I can knock out 160 acres with the drill in that time. And the only time I get
Kids
going
showing up
early
to
is
work
if I'm
at
gonna
10
do
o'clock
solar.
with their coffee and their flip-flops.
Well, I don't wear flip-flops. The whole thing between your toes just drives me nuts.
You like
So
Crocs?
I Birkenstocks.
Okay, that's fair. I don't work in Crocs either. I can't stand them. Flip-flops. Flip-flops are a hard no. I'll do slides. I'll do slippers. Flip-flops are a hard no.
Yeah.
So with so many crops, like I do want to dive into marketing, but I'm not sure I want to really dive into that one yet. I guess maybe talk a little bit about how you're managing your soil health and your fertility in an extremely dry system without irrigation, and especially without livestock, because that's one of the things that we keep hearing is you have to return livestock to the land. Now, I'm not saying that, it's not a hard and fast rule like everything else in the world. It's a very good guideline, and I'm just curious to know how you're managing your soil health and your soil fertility without livestock.
Well, you see, when I started this whole soil health journey, um, as my mother will attest, I don't take direction very well. And that was the thing, is you have to do livestock, you have to do cover crops. And that's why I also give a presentation of Don't Tell Me How to Do Soil Health, because in there I talk about why I don't do, livestock and why I don't do cover crops. But to me, the piece that really drove this whole thing home is we started doing the Haney test back in 2017 was the first one we ever ran. We ran some of the farm in 2018, and then we've run everything every year since then. And we started getting these test results where these two fields were side by side, and one of them would have a soil health score of 12, and the next one to it would have a soil health score of 10. And it's like, okay, when we pull samples, we do sampling in a pattern that is based on the agronomist GPS. So he pulls it from the same area every year. We dump them in a bucket, we mix them up. And so it's kind of that average sample kind of thing. And these two fields that are side by side have the same weather, they have the same soils. The only difference is what crops have been on there. So there's been something in our cropping system that was causing this 2-point bump in soil health. And my dad asked me, well, what are we going to do to figure this out? Well, the accounting program that we use, Farm Business Systems out of Aledo, Illinois, Dad's been using since 1984. And so as they've upgraded the program, they just kept updating the data. And back in 1984, It used to be you would close your books at the end of the year, and most farm accounting programs would delete all the detail and they would just roll the balance sheet essentially. Well, FBS decided that they didn't want to do that. Yeah, storage was expensive back then, but that it's got value, so we need to retain it. And so we actually can go back to 1985 and look at individual transactions and look at what we bought at Raleigh's machine shop. And so we have this huge database of data that, I looked at that and it's like, well, could you produce me a crop history of every field that we have? And, every year what was in every field. And he goes, yeah, I can do that. It's going to take me a little time, but it's not that big a deal. How far back do you want to go? And I said, how does 2000 sound? We went 100% no-till in 99. So I thought going back to 2000. So initially the chart had 17 years on it, everything that we had in the history and then what was currently growing. And that's the chart that I refer to. We update every year. And with that started answering some questions, and that really pushed us in the direction that we went, because those two fields that were side by side, one of them had sunflowers on it 7 years prior. The other hadn't had sunflowers on it. And so it's like, higher soil health score goes with sunflowers being in that field within the last 7 years. Wow, sunflowers have a really big effect on soil health. And, Dad started raising them in 75 and he quit raising them around 2010 because everybody always said they dry out the soil and blah, 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 blah. And everybody's so negative about them. And it's like, well, they dry out the soil because we don't raise them right. We never had that problem, but we always drilled them into really good wheat stubble. And so they had good soil cover, so it would retain the moisture over the winter because that wheat stubble would still be in there. Where everybody else, if you go out there and drill it in a bare field, well, then it bakes all summer long, it bakes all winter long, and you lose the moisture. But sunflowers have really deep tap roots. They'll go down 20 feet and they'll pull up micronutrients that have leached past everything else. And so they bring it up into that root zone. It's a really fibrous root that takes a long time to break down. And it's like, well, this is why it's affecting our soil health, is we've reintroduced micronutrients into that band, and we've given them some really good plant fiber, some organic matter for them to live on. So there's our answer. So obviously we need sunflowers. And so that is kind of like the first piece. Well, we want to reduce the amount of nitrogen we're applying, so let's start raising some legumes because they fix nitrogen. And then I started poking around, and but its exudates feed a particular family of biology of bacteria. The family are called lithotrophs, which is Latin for rock eater. So
Okay.
buckwheat exudates feed the bacteria that eat the rock in the soil, and they release the phosphorus that's in that rock that plants can't get to. And come to find out, they also release manganese. And so we added buckwheat to the rotation. And so we've kind of looked at it as like, well, what do we need? What crop can give us that? And we've seen a great response. And then, of course, we still use a little fertilizer. Dr. Christine Jones, and the first time I heard her speak, which was in the spring of 2017, which is when this whole thing started, she's all, your soils, if they have good organic matter, they can produce nutrients for you, but you need a little to kick off that biology. We don't know why, but 10 pounds at most. So that's what most of our fields get, is 10 pounds of nitrogen. And that's between some ammonium sulfate and 40 rock. to get to that 10 pounds. And we actually are probably a little bit under there. And because a lot of stuff that she was saying was making sense right up until she said, well, there's bacteria in the soil that you don't even need a legume that will produce nitrogen. And it's like, well, this lady's off a rocker. And then that year we grew a wheat crop that had great quality, high protein, high test weight, decent yield. And I thought that soil is going to be completely fried after pulling that crop off. And we went out, we did soil tests, and we had 110 pounds of residual nitrogen. And it's like, we started with 120 pounds. We pulled a great crop off. Where the heck did this come from? And then it was, oh yeah, Dr. Jones said, that there's biology in the soil that can do this, and we just have to trust it. And so these little pieces have kind of driven us in these directions to test. And my father came to the farm in 73, and he worked with his father-in-law. And my grandfather fought my father every step of the way when he wanted to innovate. And so
Familiar?
well, for most, yes. And you see, that's where I'm lucky, is because my dad had that experience. He remembered how difficult it was. So he told me when I took over that we'll do whatever you want to do, no matter how crazy, as long as you have a market. So don't raise anything without a market, and you have some evidence that it could be profitable, on an average year. And so, with that attitude, it's like, okay, well, we need to add legumes, let's do it. We need to add buckwheat, let's do it. Of course, the caveat is the market. But Dad pretty much stepped back and has let me go, and it's been interesting to watch that evolve, because the first year of I want to raise field peas, he's like, what do we know about raising field peas? That kind of thing. And it's gotten to the point where I'll go to a conference and I'll come back from a conference and he's like, okay, what are we doing now? What kind of crazy idea did you bring home? And I knew that things had really changed when I come back from a conference. He's like, what's the next crazy thing? I said, we're going to raise rice. And he goes, okay, what's your market? And I was expecting, to watch him erupt. I was really looking forward to him just losing his mind about raising rice in Northeast Colorado. And he just, okay, what's your market? And it's like, yeah, we've gotten somewhere.
Everything I know about raising rice is, okay, the limit of what I know about raising rice is it's done in a rice paddy and they're frequently flooded. So how does that work in Northeast Colorado with no irrigation?
Well, when you get 9 inches of rain, you just have to time it right. No. Do you know why they flood rice paddies?
It it's either a weed or a bug pressure, I think.
Yeah, it's weed and disease control is why they do it. So rice actually doesn't like to be flooded. It puts the soil in an anaerobic state. There's no oxygen because it's flooded, and that stresses the rice plant and it causes it to uptake arsenic. So if you hear about arsenic in rice, which you have to eat like 500 pounds a day for it to ever be in effect, or some ridiculous amount. But that's why it's there, is because it's how it's raised. Rice, I was initially told there's two kinds of rice. There's upland rice and lowland rice. Lowland rice is paddy rice. Upland rice is dryland rice. And nobody ever talks about dryland rice, upland rice. And I was talking to a rice farmer this winter, and he's like, Roy, all rice is upland rice. It's just some varieties can tolerate the flooding and others can't. And so I started doing some research, and come to find out the water needs of rice are very similar to corn. for dryland rice. And we occasionally can raise a pretty decent corn crop in this area. With the soil health that we have, it's getting a lot easier. We failed miserably this last year, but we gave it the old college try. But then, I talked that my dad, and my dad for a period was on the mission field in Africa. My grandfather was a medical missionary, and my dad went to be the hospital administrator. And part of that was a real rehabilitation section for people that had lost function due to leprosy, known as Hansen's disease now. My grandfather was actually on the team that developed the first cure for leprosy. And so Dad was in sub-Saharan Africa. He was in northern Nigeria. And there was a wet season where it rained every day. And then there was a dry season where it didn't rain for months. And he thought, well, we raised rice there, and we raised it at the end of the wet season, and then it matured in the dry season. And so I don't know why we couldn't raise rice here, because if you look at when we get the most of our moisture, our wet season is March, April through June, the first part of July, and then we have our dry season the rest of the year. And he's like, that actually makes sense. And so the challenge is now getting rice seed. I tested 10 different heirloom varieties last year in my garden. What an excellent year to choose to raise rice for the first time. The first thing we learned is rabbits love dryland rice. I think it was because it was the only green thing that was, had a nice juicy leaf. And man, they ate that stuff off to the ground like 3 different times. And finally we got the garden fenced, and the rice ended up maturing late, right when it was super hot and windy, and it didn't pollinate well, but it went ahead and it headed out. It tried. Looks like Johnson grass when it's growing. So a nice wide leathery leaf, beautiful plant. It'd leave awesome residue if you run a stripper header through it. And so this year I've got a couple of things working, or I think I might have finally scored enough rice seed that we're going to have 5 acres of dryland rice in Northeast Colorado.
Are you going to like save that seed and keep building that up so you can have more than 5 acres of rice?
Yes, most definitely. Interesting thing about rice is it has the highest multiplication rate of any cereal grain. And I noticed that this last year, man, it tillered like crazy. So 1 grain of rice on average produces about 150 grains of rice. So okay, it's really easy to multiply. It's a high yielding crop, especially if you're in good moisture. And that's why if you look where they raise rice on paddies, if you watch YouTube videos of them harvesting, it's the biggest combine they can buy, with like this little 14, 16 foot header on it. And that combine is just crawling through the field. They always say you should never buy equipment that's been in rice. And I always thought, well, yeah, it's been in water. No, it's rice is high. The rice hulls are high in silica, and there's a huge volume. I mean, they'll yield 30,000 pounds an acre in some of these areas. And it literally just wears the inside of the combine out. And that's why you don't want to buy a rice machine. So yeah, we're going to keep some of that back. And then of course, some of it, I've gotten the lead on a rice huller, and we are working with a restaurant group in Denver that has told me if you raise rice, we will buy it. And
okay, I gotta know, if you're only going to do like 5 acres of rice, how many pounds of rice are you talking about with that to go be able to deal with the restaurant to get rid of that rice crop? Like, growing so many crops, like I can't wait to get into marketing with you because I'm sure that there's all kinds of rabbit trails to chase, but like, I just got to know, like, okay,
That's why I need a
rice,
bigger farm.
5 acres of rice, and you got a restaurant in Denver that wants to buy all you can grow. That strikes me as strange, but so I'm wondering, like, how much are you planning on growing off that 5 acres?
Well, I'm expecting about 2,000 pounds an acre. So that's going to give me 10,000 pounds, which would be enough to seed 100 acres at 100 pounds an acre. And we do 80s. So if we did an 80 of it, we might do a 40 of it, depending upon how things are going. That leaves me a little bit left over. Now, the one thing you have to understand is the restaurant that we're working with in Denver. Um,
It's
my
not an
wife
Asian
and
food restaurant, I'm assuming.
it's a very special restaurant. I took my wife there for her birthday. And the only reason I could take my wife there for her birthday is they wanted to meet the farmer, and they comped us our meal. And otherwise it's about $250 a person. The food was absolutely incredible. Um, it was 7 courses with 6 matching drink choices that went with that, and came across a beer that's made in Oklahoma that they age it in oak barrels with coffee beans, vanilla beans, and cocoa beans. And it's this stout that is just, my wife doesn't like stout beer, and she's like, we need to get some of this. It's absolutely amazing. But they don't, so they're not looking at a huge quantity. They're not looking at using, 50 pounds of rice a day.
Well,
They're looking at
10,000
designing a
pounds
menu.
is a lot of rice.
10,000 pounds is a lot of rice. I mean, and that's, part of it is now if we're trying to feed the world, we can't do it with 10,000 pounds of rice.
No,
But I can work with a restaurant group that's designing their menu around what I have. And so we can work on that. But so yeah, that's the story of rice in Northeast Colorado. Now the idea isn't as crazy as you think it is. The National Rice Council has identified Colorado will either be the fourth or fifth largest rice producing state in the nation by 2050. Due to what we're seeing in our climate, it could warm enough that wheat will no longer vernalize in Colorado. It won't get cold enough. And where they're currently growing rice, they won't be able to grow anything because it's going to be just so hot. And so that rice production has to move, and we need a crop to raise. And there are parts of Colorado that has irrigation either out of the Ogallala or surface water. That could be turned into some pretty decent rice production. Or if we can do it in dryland setting and offset that wheat, because there's a lot of bushels of wheat that are produced in Colorado on dry land, it would be that opportunity. I just want to get out in front of the curve, because that way I'll be known as that guy that did it for the first time ever, and now everybody's doing it. So,
is there anybody else around you trying rice?
I cannot say with 100% certainty, but no. But my certainty factor is not 100, but it's a number really, really close to 100.
I mean, the guy next door that you think is just past his eyeballs in commodity debt with the bank. I mean, you never know what he's got going on behind the shelter belt.
That's very true. They're probably growing something a little greener and stinkier than rice in the shelter belt, if that's the case. It is Colorado.
Yeah, it is Colorado. I hadn't really thought, my brain wasn't there. um, so what are some of the other crops you grow? You mentioned field peas, dry beans, pinto beans, and buckwheat. What are some of the other weird things you grow?
Traditionally we raise wheat. The funny thing is when my folks and I went to the CCTA conference down at Burlington in 2017, when we started, learning these things, when I listened to Lance Gunderson talk about the Haney test, we're driving home and I said to my dad, if we want to look at some more diversity, there'd be a day that we're not going to raise wheat. And my dad laughed and said, yeah, that'll be the day. We don't have any wheat this year. And I thought it might take a little bit longer than 5-6 years, but no, it didn't. So we're also raising oats, buckwheat, non-GMO corn, grain sorghum, we call it Milo, sunflowers, millet, pinto beans, chickpeas, flax, black-eyed peas, black beans. We mentioned field peas, and then camelina. And we've raised a couple other things that are like, that doesn't work very well here, or just not happy with what I'm seeing in terms of residue, or just not liking it, or I just don't have room. That's the biggest challenge with 2,200 acres. I really need another 1,000 acres, a couple thousand acres, to really build out the rotation to what I would want out of it. But when I came back to the farm there in the fall of 2016, my grandmother had passed away the year prior. My parents became the landlords, and we had a bunch of unencumbered land. And my parents said, well, do you want to go buy more land? And my response was no. It doesn't make a sense if we go buy more land, because we're losing money on what we got. So we're going to go buy more land so we can lose more money. I said, I want to be profitable. I want to be profitable with what we have before we start to expand, because that way, when we expand, the expansion is being paid for, not financed necessarily, or if it is financed, we know exactly how we're going to pay it off.
I bet you wish you could buy it at the land prices it was in 16, 17.
Yeah, but at the same time, when you start seeing an increase in revenue that we are, the land price isn't near as bad as what you thought it was. We literally took our gross revenue and we have turned it into our net revenue. And so when people ask me, is regenerative agriculture, is practicing soil health profitable? It's like, oh, it's fun. It's that profitable. I mean, I went out and bought a $70,000 Weed Zapper because I could, we did finance it, to be completely honest, but that conversation with the banker my folks and I went into the bank, we sat in the loan officer's office, and we said, we're thinking about buying this piece of equipment. Here's the reason why. Here's the website. And he goes and he watches a video on the website, and he goes, well, that's interesting. Well, how much does it cost? I said, well, at the time, all in, we were about 70,000. And he's making some notes on the desk, and well, how much down? And we probably 10. And he's just making some notes, and we then went on to talk about all kinds of other things, because we don't keep secrets from our banker. We figure he needs to know how we're spending his money, because we quit farming with ours a long time ago. And went through this, and we got up to leave, and he looks down at that piece of paper and he said, well, the loan committee meets tomorrow. I'll take it to him. He goes, I don't see any problems. And it's like, we were just coming to find out what kind of loan rates you were offering. We weren't even totally convinced we were going to buy it yet. But okay, well, if you're down with it, then that's cool. But that's because we have proven ourselves in what we're doing, and reducing the inputs makes a big difference. This year, with my grandfather bought the farm in 50. I'd like to buy a lot of land at the prices that he paid, because we're talking like $25 an acre. Yeah, but my mom grew up on this farm and has always been connected with it. And this last year was the driest year ever for this farm. It was probably, if it wasn't the hottest, it was darn close to it. If it wasn't the windiest, it was darn close to it. And we went and met with our accountant at the end of the year, and he runs the numbers, and he's like, if it wasn't for depreciation, you'd be paying taxes this year. And so we broke even thanks to depreciation on the driest year in the history of the farm. And when I started putting these ideas together and looking at the marketing stuff and the crop diversity and what it was going to do in terms of nutrients and chemical usage, I went to my dad and I said, well, I've got an idea of what I think we're going to do, but there's something that you're going to have to get used to. And he said, well, what's that? And I said, well, you're going to have to get used to paying taxes, because before we were the average dryland farm in Northeast Colorado, where your goal is to break even. And you work an off-farm job because that's what you do to live. I'm paid on salary, and we are showing profitability. We're looking at bringing in my stepson to be a tractor jockey initially to teach him farming, and looking at it like, it actually cash flows. A couple of years ago, with all the different things that we were doing, my dad one day stops and looks at me and goes, so how many employees are we going to have in 5 years? And I looked at him, and without really putting much thought to it, I said 5. Well, we have a hired man that it's a very unique situation. We're blessed to have him. We're looking at adding Justin. His fiance has a unique set of skills that might fit really well into what we're doing on our marketing and things that we're raising. So there's 3, and if I count myself, because I'm actually getting paid, there's 4. It's really different. It's sometimes, looking back at it, it's really hard to comprehend how all this stuff has come together and has done what I envisioned it doing.
Yep. And I was just sitting here thinking that, if you had a neighbor that had the same acreage you did, that'd probably be just like you described. He'd probably be barely scraping by. 2022, drought, heat, wind. Oh yeah, I felt it. I didn't make any money. Like I took a loss at 22. I'm not gonna be ashamed of that. And I was talking to my dad, and there were 3 years while he was around the ranch that he didn't turn profit and make money, and they were all really bad drought years. So, I think about the guy that's next to you that's got the same size, that's on the same land base. He's working a town job for the insurance and money to survive, pay the house bills, and the farm barely breaks even year after year after year. And here you are trying to expand, looking to buy more acres, even at current market price, which I feel is horribly overvalued no matter where you are in the plains. Like, everything is just so horribly overvalued. You're talking about adding acres and adding employees to expand. And I think the key to that is all marketing. Growing stuff like camelina and buckwheat and dry beans and field peas, and 5 acres of rice that's going to be profitable. I know guys that would plant 5 acres of something as an experiment and just write the cost off to see if it worked. It's wild that you can do that and have a market outlet. So let's go ahead and swing into marketing. How do you get rid of some of these things like pinto beans?
Well,
Area that doesn't grow pinto beans.
The funny thing is, when I the average farmer, you talk to him about raising something different, he goes, well, I can't do it. And the reason why is there's no markets. There's
Right.
nothing nearby. I mean,
Co-op
that
won't take that.
exactly.
Elevator won't take it.
And that is the exact world that I lived in 6 years ago. And I believed the exact same thing. I thought there are no markets out there. But a book that I read and I spent a lot of time working through is 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And one thing that they talk about in 7 Habits is mentality. Because really that's the only thing you really can control is what's going on between your ears. The rest of the world, we think we have some control, and then we learn that we don't, and everything falls apart. And the only thing we have to control at that point is that. I went through some pretty rough times personally, and that's when I worked through that book. And when I come out the other side, I had a very different attitude. And one other thing that they talk about in that book was, that attitude of scarcity, that there's not enough. And you see that in agriculture, where if you do find a market, boy, you hold on to that little piece as hard as you can. I have a good friend, Mike D. And I told him every time I'm going to tell this story, I'm going to give him credit because it really drove a point home. And Mike at the time worked for Ardent Mills. He was well up in the company. And we were talking one day and he goes, Roy, I don't understand farmers. And I was like, Mike, what don't you understand about farmers? Because let's be honest, we're actually a pretty simple lot. There's not too much to us that should confuse a person. And he said, Roy, what I don't understand is they spend every day fighting over the same piece of the pie, and they live in the damn bakery. And it's like, you're absolutely right, Mike. I had never looked at it that way. Farmers say, well, I have to raise corn. Well, do you have to? Or do you raise corn because it's easy and that's what you've always done? So my mentality changed through what, my experiences, to the mentality of abundance, of there's enough for everyone. There's more than enough for everyone. And when people challenged me on that, I said, when was the last time you've been to Denver? Because that's our closest big city. Denver is 50 miles closer to the farm now than it was when I was a kid. And it's not because we moved, it's because it grew. And it's not stopping growing. People have learned that Colorado has beautiful weather. Even in the middle of winter, it's very rare that we've been as cold as we've been for as long as we've been. It's very rare that we have snow laying on the ground for more than a week. And there's 3 million people on the Front Range now. And those 3 million people, last time I checked, they eat, and they like to eat. And they like to eat a lot of different things. I talked about going to that super fancy restaurant. They designed their menu this winter around buckwheat, and everything in that servings had buckwheat in it in one form or another. And I had never had buckwheat in that many forms, and I had never had buckwheat that was so delicious. I mean, the closing aperitif was buckwheat tea, toasted buckwheat tea, soba tea. It was absolutely freaking amazing. And after that meal, I was feeling kind of full. There wasn't a lot in each course, but there were 7 courses. And I was feeling kind of full, and I drank that buckwheat tea, and it was like my system's like, okay, we're satisfied. And that feeling of fullness, I felt full, but I wasn't like stuffed. Because that buckwheat tea helped my digestion. But these people like different things. They don't eat just corn, because the corn that we raise doesn't go to people for the most part. It's processed through a refined biological process, called like a cow.
Yep. And I just like, I'll pause you for a second. That's a great point. And I have it written down here. Like 98% of the corn grown in the United States is for livestock feed. It's just that 2% that we get our popcorn, our sweet corn, our canned corn, the creamed corn, corn on the cob. Like 2% of the corn acres. So, y'all listeners, think about that when you're driving past all these cornfields you see. Only 2% of the corn grown in the United States actually goes to humans. Another interesting number, and I'm probably going to misquote this a little bit. Kansas grows about 4,000 acres of red potatoes. That's over 10% of the nation's red potato crop. I had no idea that we grew 10% of the nation's red potato crop in Kansas, but it only takes 4,000 acres. Like, I could travel the state for the rest of my life and not drive by a damn potato field. So that does kind of put things in perspective when we're talking about, 5 acres of rice or 100 acres of camelina or 100 acres of dry beans. Like, 10,000 pounds of rice sounds like a lot of rice. It's probably like a restaurant-sized quantity of rice for them to operate on in a season. But 10,000 pounds of rice to you and me, I mean, that's like rice for the rest of our lives.
Well, and we do farm tours, and part of our farm tours is we start out at the grain bins, and we have the grain bins that my dad put up in 1980. It's about 32,000 bushel. And I talk with the people about, let's do some just really quick and dirty math. So 30,000 bushels, and a bushel of wheat will make 60 loaves of really crappy bread. So, and that's most of the bread that people eat is the really refined white stuff. And so 30,000 loaves, 60,000 bushels. Well, that gives us about 1.8 million loaves of bread. That's a lot of bread. That's a lot of bread. But if I took that bread to Denver, that would be a loaf for maybe one in every 2 households. So half the people would get a loaf of bread.
For one day.
That's for one, yeah. And that loaf of bread will last them maybe a week. We cannot comprehend the volume of food that is consumed in our nation on a daily basis. We're not talking about for the whole year. We're just talking about one day. And COVID, it was bad, but there are some things that came out of COVID that were really invaluable. One of them was people realizing the value of abundant food. And it's okay to be picky about the food that you eat, because it's something that should be treasured. I mean, we Americans have the cheapest food in the world. We have the most abundant food in the world. We don't have the healthiest food in the world, but the reason is how it's being farmed, and that's why we do what we do. Is we are trying to change how that food is raised to make it healthier. It doesn't need to be as abundant. We don't need everything that we have. And if our food is healthier, we won't eat as much because our bodies will be satisfied. And that's why people continue to eat and eat and eat when they're full, because their body's like, I need this one particular thing. And you need to keep eating because I need it. And, our customers with our direct marketing stuff, they'll tell us that, well, I would cook up a cup of beans and our family would eat that at a meal. We cook up a cup of your beans And first of all, they taste way better than the dry beans that we bought in the store. And it's like, well, a dry bean's a dry bean, right? Um, they taste better, but we only eat half of them because we eat that half and we're full. And so that is the whole point of soil health, of regenerative farming, is to increase that nutrition. And suddenly we don't need to raise as much as we were, and we can raise more things, and we have more diversity. Is because of how it's raised, it actually makes us a healthier people. I've made the comment before, and I'll stand with it, of obesity in this nation can be solved with regenerative agriculture.
I agree. I agree.
Um,
Reason why we're not going to see that pushed like on a real high level, or pushed to the degree that it should. It seems like there's a bunch of lawmakers that are invested in pharmaceutical corporations that like to make insulin. Like there's no money in curing diabetes. There's no money in teaching people how to eat better so they don't develop health problems later in life. But there is piles and piles of money made to be in treating quote chronic disease that really, let's be honest, a lot of it's preventable. Adult onset diabetes would go away if we got rid of corn subsidies. Okay, maybe that's a stretch, but if we quit putting high fructose corn syrup in everything and adding sugar and salt to everything, that'd be step one. Step two, like let's get rid of the enriched wheat flour. Let's get rid of all the crap that's enriched and go back to whole grains, and let's see what happens then.
yeah.
And commodity agriculture, industrial agriculture, the whole Earl Butts model, get big or get out, we got to feed the world. Man, I think that is crumbling.
Well, one thing that I try to bring up in my talks is the most important mentality change a farmer can make is the day that they realize that everything they grow is food. And it seems logical, but I have a good friend I was talking with about this. He worked in a grocery store through high school and college, and every night his part of his job was to count all the cash drawers. And he said, Roy, I would sit down and I would count $10,000 in cash a night. And to me, that wasn't the same thing as the $5 bill in my pocket. And to a farmer, that semi load of wheat is not related to that loaf of bread because of the processing and the distance we are from that processing. We've lost that knowledge. And I, in one of my talks, it was a local talk, and I made that comment that everything that we raise is food. And I was contacted on Twitter that night by an individual that was there, that I know. He's a good farmer, a lot of respect for him. And he said, Roy, I've been sitting here for the last hour and a half, wrapping my head around that everything we raise is food. He goes, I have never thought about what I raise as food. And you're like, okay, well, you can see that. He raises kidney beans. What use is there for kidney beans other than food?
Chili. That's about it.
Well, yeah. I mean, and my thought was, you've never taken a bucket full out of the truck home and cooked it? You know, I don't know. Maybe I grew up poor enough where you had to learn how to eat some stuff like that. But that change in mentality is vital. Ray Archuleta, in his talk in Lakin, was talking about what's the hardest thing on the farm. And the hardest thing on the farm is not compacted soil. It's the farmer's mind. And once we learn to loosen that and create fertile ground between the farmer's ears, well, then we're going to have fertile ground everywhere else.
I
And
think
that's
the
what I
great
do.
exact quote is the only compaction problem on the farm is compaction of the mind.
Yes. And that's, I mean, that's why I get out and talk about what we're doing is trying to show people that this can be done. And yeah, we're an extreme case, but I also tell people, take from this what will work for you and adapt it. Don't try to copy what I'm doing. I guarantee you the neighbor across the road can't do the exact same thing that we're doing. And the reason is because the land is different. Every piece of land is unique because it has its own history. And we illustrated that when we started doing the Haney test, and we had two fields side by side that the only difference was their history, and it made a difference in that field and how it would respond to different farming methods. So that is, the big thing is farmers have to find their way, and the other half of that goes, the consumers have to find their way, because a farmer's not going to raise anything that he can't sell. And so the consumer has to be able to step up and be like, well, I'd really like to buy pinto beans that are grown in Colorado. There's actually a fair number of pinto beans grown in Colorado. They're actually under irrigation.
Down
And
around like Rocky Ford, that
no, up in this area.
I know that, like down around Rocky Ford, going back and forth, to the Pueblo, Colorado Springs area and going out to Southwest Colorado to ride in the mountains, all down Highway 400 around Rocky Ford, it's melons, cantaloupes, and beans.
Yep. And in my mind, beans require a lot of water. That's just how I was raised. Because the only time I ever saw them growing was under a pivot. Or if I have them in my garden, well, I water my garden. That's not the case. Legumes are actually the dry edible beans, pinto beans, black-eyed peas, black beans. They are tough, man. As long as they don't get a freeze, that's the one thing that slows them down is cold. But this last summer, hardly any moisture. We had beautiful stands of stuff this last year. I wish it had rained, but at the same time, it was better than it didn't, because I learned so much from this year. They just sat out there in the field and stayed alive. And the 21st of September, we got 1.5 inches of rain, and immediately those beans started blooming. And they started setting pods, and of course it froze 2 weeks later. But if it hadn't have froze, they would have made a crop on that one rain that they were waiting on. I was the president of the local farmers union chapter, and I passed that on to my stepson. But back in 2019, everybody was complaining about how rough farming was. And
it's 2019 was the last good year we all had.
Well, but that's when prices were in the tank, and there was the tariff stuff and all those different things, and people were complaining. And a buddy of mine that worked for Farmers Union said, Roy, what we should do is get a bunch of old timers together and have them talk about tough times in farming. So we searched out and we found 6 fellas, and they brought their wives, and the youngest was 85. The
Nice.
oldest was in his 90s. And the meeting started, I think it was either 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the evening. Because these are some old timers, they go to bed early, and had a hard time getting them started. They're like, well, what do you want us to talk about? And it's like, okay, tell us about your first crop. And that's all it took. and it was off to the races. And that came out, and the crops that they raised out here. They raised dryland beans. During World War II, the government required farmers to raise dry beans on a portion of their farm because that's what they used to feed the troops. And, then the wives talked about, well, did you guys go out into the bean fields and pick the green pods? And they canned them as green beans. And it was like, everybody raised dryland edible beans back in the 40s. Well, this is new. Well, no, it's not. This is something that's forgotten. And, they talked about how they would raise flax for cattle feed because corn didn't do so hot, because it was before all the advancements in corn genetics and methods. They talked about how, clover was one of the most common crops grown in Northeast Colorado, because the guys would raise clover till about the middle of summer, and then they'd work it in the ground, and that's how they got nitrogen for their wheat that winter. And it's like, well, crap, I ain't doing nothing new. All I'm doing is I'm the first one to the pile of knowledge of this is how we used to do it, and it still works. And you don't need all these inputs. So, the dry beans fit our climate. And, getting back to marketing, when I started wanting to raise these things, Dad goes, well, where are you going to sell them? And it's like, well, I don't know. And I got out something, it's called the Yellow Pages. They still occasionally, you can find copies of them.
I haven't seen one of those in years.
And I opened it up, and there are 6 bean companies within 100 miles of the farm. And now when it comes to harvest, I raise my beans without a contract, which is crazy because when I first started doing it, everything was contracted. Now I'll harvest it and I'll call up the different bean companies. I'll tell them, of Palomino, a variety of pinot beans. It's a slow darkening pinot. This is how much I have. What do you offer me? And I'll call each bean company and I'll take kind of what their bid is. And the one that gives me the best price, that's where I go with it. Mind you, we set aside some for direct sales. And we set aside stuff for seed. We find varieties that we can legally hold back for seed. But in my mind, there's no market. There's no market for other crops. So I started with that mentality. I started with that scarcity of I got to keep every little piece that I have. And the more I do this, I joke now I can go to the fridge and get out the jug of milk, and there's another market behind the jug of milk. I get phone calls on a regular basis of companies looking for specific things. I got a phone call from a company in Canada looking for buckwheat this last fall. Our buckwheat crop died. I actually apologized to my parents for the buckwheat crop dying. And my mom looks at me and goes, well, that's okay. We just raised a cover crop this year. And, for that mentality to be in place from the traditional mentality that we started with 5-6 years ago, that's a pretty impressive growth on the farmer side. But, these people from Canada call me and I'm like, well, how much buckwheat are you looking for? Just if I find some. He goes, well, we'd like 300 metric tons. And it was like, I can raise that in like 3 years if we're lucky. But there's the demand for it. It's just farmers, they like to push the easy button. And, the relationship that they have with the food that they produce generally ends at the trap or the tailgate of the truck when it goes to the grain elevator. They, the guy at the elevator opens that up, it gets dumped into the pit, it gets elevated into these giant bins where it's mixed with everything else, and that's it. It's gone. It's no longer that loaf of bread that sits in the kitchen. And so getting farmers to recognize that and see that is huge. And that's why my wife and I are working on developing a marketing workbook for farmers to work through, just to get them to see the possibilities and to develop what their story is. Because with the millennials, the most valuable thing that a farmer has is their story.
Yes.
You know, when we create packaging on our mixes, I know that every single word on that package will be read by somebody under the age of 40. And they care about their food, where it comes from. You know, can they meet the person? And it really changes who they are and how they interact with their food compared to their parents. And this, my wife and I went to the farm show in Greeley this last week. She had never been. The Colorado Department of Ag had a get together for the STAR program producers. So we went up for that. We stayed the night, and I told my wife, take another day off work, because she does work a decent job. That's where our insurance comes from. Take a day off work. We're going to go to the farm show because I've talked about it, but you'd never been. And so we went to the farm show, and we're walking up and down the aisles of all the different shiny things that we have either no need for, or really can't afford, or don't want to afford. And we're walking down this aisle, and this woman who's working a booth points at me and goes, "You're Roy Pfaltzgraff." And it's like, yeah, I am. Who are you? And she's working a booth for Colorado State University. I'm not even sure what they were talking about there. But she goes, "Well, my boyfriend's Eric. He's the one of the camera crew on the documentary that came to the farm last year." "Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, I know Eric." And I looked at her and I said, "So you're Eric's girlfriend that is celiacs, that can only eat gluten-free?" And she goes, "Yeah." She goes, "I love your gluten-free mixes. I drive to Wheat Ridge twice a month to pick up mixes from the farmers market that we're at down there." And for those of you that have not had the opportunity to drive from Fort Collins, Colorado to Wheat Ridge, Colorado, it's down I-25. I've
Right
heard
at the
that.
Platte River, right?
No, that's I-76.
Okay.
So I-25 it's parallel to the mountains. It runs, well, way north of Cheyenne down to Albuquerque. And that ribbon of death, Mad Max would have nightmares going down. I mean, it is a rough drive. There's construction like every other mile, so there's lane changes. People aren't paying attention. And it's all run at 70, 80 miles an hour, and immediately comes to a stop and turns into a parking lot because of some accident. So it's not pleasant.
Yes. Yes. The stretch between Pueblo and the Springs is bad enough. Like the stretch
Yeah,
between the Springs and Denver, yeah, I'll go around. Thank you.
yeah. And the stretch from Denver to Fort Collins is as bad as Denver to Colorado Springs. I mean, it is not a healthy drive. This woman will make the drive twice a month to go buy our mixes because she knows where they came from. She has a dietary issue that we fit into, that we address, and they're delicious. That people that aren't gluten-free can eat them and not realize that they didn't have something that had gluten in it. But yeah, it's farmers change people's lives by the food that they raise. And this isn't the first time that we have had an experience similar to that, of where people value us because of the food we raise and the diversity we have. And that's why we do the marketing thing. Is there's 3 million people in Denver. I can't feed them with my 2,000 acres. I need everybody else helping me do that. And we all can live in abundance. We all can be comfortable. Our children can come back to the farm. I was talking, 15 years ago with the president of Viero, which is a phone company that was founded in Fort Morgan, Colorado. It's now expanding across the plains. And I was talking with the president, and I was talking with him about growing a business in rural Colorado. And he said, the hardest part about it isn't customers. The hardest part about it is employees, because the biggest export that we have in Northeast Colorado is not commodities, it's our children. Because our children go to Denver, they go to college, they get an education, they become engineers and doctors, and they do very successful things. Part of the reason is because they grew up on a farm and they have work ethic, and they see the value in that. He says, do you know how hard it is to grow a company with the bottom 1/3 of the graduating class? And he's right.
It's a good point.
And so, when people talk about regenerative agriculture, a friend of mine was speaking down at Lakin, Gail. And if
Brother Gail Fuller?
Yes.
He's my friend, Roy.
If you haven't heard Gail speak, I would take a strong dose of antidepressant before you do, because he's pretty darn honest with how rough things can be.
He tells it like it is, and he always has. He doesn't pull any punches, and he's not going to say anything to make you feel better.
No. And I had never heard Gail speak, and the first time I heard him speak down there, I was like, whoa. But you're dead on about what he says. And so that afternoon, it was the closing keynote. He was speaking about what is regenerative agriculture, and it's not defined, and looking at the mental health aspect. And it's something that I had been pondering for a long time. And so at that point, while he was speaking, I pull out my phone and I write up what my vision of regenerative agriculture is. And regenerative agriculture, it starts with changing the soil, but it ends with changing the food system and the possibilities that our rural communities have that come with it. And the kicker is, I haven't done anything with this. I've had a number of people read it and they're like, that's, it's good. Now, what are you going to do? And it's like, I don't know. Is it meant for successful farming or the New York Times? And so with my wife's urging, and I've been dragging my feet on this because, I don't know, it might sound weird to some people, but sometimes success is a scary thing, and do I want to write this book about what is regenerative agriculture that's based upon this 7 or 8 paragraph thing that I put down? But at the same time, it's a story that needs to be told. And it's not just for the farmer that it needs to be told. It needs to be told for the consumer. It needs to be told for our soil, which in turn needs to be told for the health of our nation. But it all goes back to, you wanted to get into marketing. Well, the reason that marketing is important is because of these huge effects that we have long term on these things that we don't think about. We don't see what's that impact of a guy in Northeast Colorado that's reduced his chemicals and herbicide usage by 75% or more. What's the big deal there? Well, the big deal there is he's growing a highly diverse rotation that anybody can do with an air seeder, a sprayer, and a combine. No special equipment. Anybody can do this, and they can take it either to commodity market. I'm working with a company right now that is looking at buying a grain elevator to focus strictly on regeneratively grown crops, that they're going to use the Colorado Star program as the foundation for scoring this so they can take it to food companies. So as we get these links put together, this is important for our nation, because as long as we take care of the soil, the next generation that comes after us has something to work with. If I kept farming the way I was farming, when my stepson comes back to the farm, well, first of all, I don't know if I could afford to bring him back to the farm. Second of all, he'd only be able to do it when he's in his 40s and 50s, not when he's 19, because I couldn't afford to do that. And the only reason I would need somebody is because physically I couldn't do it anymore, because mentally and physically I'm shot. You wonder why farmers commit suicide. It's because they have the weight of the generations of work of their family on their shoulders every day. You know, if I go bankrupt and lose the farm, not only have I lost what I've worked for, but I've lost what my father has spent 40 years of his life and what my grandfather spent 40 years plus of his life doing. Everything that 3 generations of my family has worked on is gone. And so that weight hangs over my head. And I don't know if it necessarily consciously hangs over my head, but every farmer has that on them.
Yes.
And that stress is there every day because they're so worried about making money. But as a farmer in Northeast Colorado, if I can find a way and share it with others and show them that there's markets out there, that you can be profitable, your children can come back, we can build food processing in our community instead of shipping it to Denver, and we can process it and package it here and then ship it to Denver, then all the dollars start flowing to the plains instead of flowing to the city. And suddenly we have a rural economy that is living in abundance, that is regenerating itself, that is bringing life back to the land. And that is why I do this. And this is why I get fired up and I get way off base, because it is so damned important that we do this.
I can't disagree with anything you just said, Roy. You know, the narrative that industrial agriculture, commodity agriculture is feeding the world is just flat out wrong. I'm still looking for the receipts on this, but I saw or read a paper that said that somewhere between like 75 and 82% of the food that's consumed on Earth is grown by subsistence farmers. So America's commodity farmers that are feeding the world, there's maybe a 20% slice in there that they can say they're feeding. And the model doesn't work. The model of industrial commodity agriculture is not sustainable for rural America. It's not sustainable for land ownership. It's not sustainable without government subsidy. And ultimately, you take away any one of those legs of the pot and the system starts to fall. Commodity agriculture doesn't feed the world. It feeds the pocketbooks of some bankers, some big ag chemical companies, companies, shareholders, maybe even some legislators that own shares in some of those companies. That's who industrial agriculture is designed to feed. It's not designed to feed people. It's not designed to feed the world, especially not designed to feed your community or my community. Like when you have a small, quote, farming and ranching community that's surrounded by farms, that's surrounded by cattle, you can't buy a damn thing made in this county here. I mean, barely. You can't go to the grocery store and buy anything that's really produced in this county. And what's worse than that is we've got a Dollar General in town. And they just opened a Family Dollar this year. You tell me why in a town of 1,800 people that has been shrinking for the last 40 years, we get a Dollar General and a Family Dollar? Companies like that don't.
There's money to be extracted.
I love what Mike Calicrate says about about companies like that. They're just they're the vultures showing up to pick the last wealth from the bones of rural America. And there's some communities around, can't remember any of the names that like told Dollar General and Family Dollar to pack sand. Like, no, you cannot come in here. You cannot come in here. And I applaud those efforts. Yeah, Dollar General might show up and offer 2 or 3 jobs that aren't currently present in the community, but those really aren't that great of jobs. And it's probably going to kill more jobs in the community than it creates, of local enterprise or a small business. I guess I don't have to rant about Family Dollar. Everybody hears me do it often enough. I want to hear about your wife. You teased me earlier that your wife was from Chicago, suburbs of Chicago. My mother is actually from Highland Park, Illinois. That's where she's from. So she spent a lot of time there. Had a lot of family between Highland Park, Northbrook. Yeah, I'm going to quit there because I'm going to forget a bunch of it. But so I'm passingly familiar with the suburbs, kind of up on the north end of Chicago. I did my Navy boot camp up there too. So how does your wife fit in all this? You teased me with it earlier, and I'm not sure how to get back there.
So she was born and raised, I think, Arlington Heights. When we met, she was living in Crystal Lake. So that's
Okay.
the Northwest.
Arlington Heights, Buffalo Grove. That was I was kind of searching for that, but Buffalo Grove is right next to Arlington Heights, and Buffalo Grove was the last place my mom lived before she moved out to Vegas.
So that's where she was born and raised. That's where my stepson was born and raised. Of course, you hear about those people that are from a different time that are now. He's definitely from a different time. He's currently working in a feedlot, and he enjoys working with cattle. He hates working at a feedlot, which I can agree with the second part. The first part, I've been run over by enough cows in my life that we used to have a calf operation. When he comes back to the farm, if he wants to do that, well, he can do that, and then we'll have some livestock. But I'm not just adding livestock to add livestock. But Barb and I met on there's an app called Words with Friends.
Okay.
And it's essentially a 2-person Scrabble game, and you're randomly matched up with people, or you can play with people that you know from Facebook or whatever. And so I was matched up with this gal. And to be honest with you, I am not a good speller at all. There's a reason I went to the Colorado School of Mines. It's because you don't have to take writing at the Colorado School of Mines. You have to take lots of math and science classes, but I can do that. But you don't have to be able to string words together on a piece of paper that somebody else will agree is quality or not. So in Words with Friends, my strong suit was strategy of, can I get things laid out where I can get that triple word score, and that's what was, I would have like a winning move kind of thing that would just have a crushing score. And I pretty much played the whole game strategizing to get that to happen. Well, I started playing this gal, and every time I was like this close to dropping that 150 point word, she'd play in that spot every single damn time. And it was starting to piss me off a little bit. So I sent her a message, and I'm like, you need to stop playing in the spot that I'm getting ready to play in. And her response was boo-hoo, literally. And that's how we started. We continued to play. I think we started playing at the end of July, 1st of August in 2016. I asked her for her phone number after a while. She said no. So, but we started messaging back and forth, and I asked her, well, if you could live anywhere, where would you live? And she responded with, on a farm. And I'm like, ooh, because I know exactly where I'm going to live. And I texted her back, well, I have a farm. And she thought, yeah, right. And so then she replied with, well, on my farm, I'd have chickens. And I said, well, I have chickens. And she thought, well, I've just met the biggest bullshitter on Words with Friends. And so we continued to talk and, message. And finally, she one day said, well, you know what? I'll give you my phone number, but you have to earn it. I'll give you 2 digits for every time you win a game. Well, hold it. I'm a math guy, and there's statistics there. So I immediately went to statistics, and I looked, well, she's winning 80% of the time. I'm winning 20% of the time. So 1 game out of 5, I would get 2 digits. If I need to get 10 digits, it's 9, but whatever. If I need to get 10 digits, that means I need to win 5 times. So that means I need to play 25 games. It's pretty simple.
Yeah, that's easy math.
Yeah. And the game that we were playing, well, suddenly, like I said, I'm lazy. Well, now I'm motivated.
Yeah.
And I was losing that game by 50 points, and I won that game by 50 points. And she immediately thought, oh, crap, what just happened? And
Roy,
then
Roy started trying a little harder.
Exactly. Yeah, I got a little motivation there. So I started requesting a whole bunch of games, and she put her foot down on that pretty darn quick, because it's all about volume at this point.
Yep.
And so we ended up talking for the first time on the 26th of October that year. And I said, well, you got to come visit the farm. And she's like, I will never come visit your farm.
She didn't believe you that you had a farm.
Yeah. Well, and I, she finally came and visited the day after Christmas that year. So I tell people I had to go out and find a farm and a family that would claim that I was theirs with some chickens, so that I wasn't lying to her, because I had told her this. She came and visited for the first time the day after Christmas in 2016. And before she left, she had contacted her family members and said, if you do not hear from me for at least once a day, here is the address of where I'll be, and you need to call the sheriff and send him out, because who knows what kind of crazy person I'm going to go visit. And that's how it started. Now, she is the reason for a lot of the stuff that we do, because her background, her bachelor's degree is in marketing. And she said, well, if you could do anything with your farm, what would you do? And I said, well, I'd love to be able to sell to the public. I'd love to be able to talk with the public. And if I sell to them, well, then I get to know them, they get to know me, and then they learn what agriculture is really about. Because from when I was a little kid, my dad always stressed that the most important job that farmers have is educating the public about farming. It's not growing food, it's education, because it all comes down to numbers again. The 3 million people in Denver could get together and they could pass something that would put us out of business.
I tried. I mean,
and they'll do that unless they know us, because then they support us and their numbers are suddenly on our side. And so this education aspect, and so when we started our direct sales to consumers, it wasn't to be profitable. That was actually nowhere on the spectrum of why we're doing this. We're doing this so we can meet people that go, well, glyphosate is the worst thing that's ever been invented. And we can explain to them why it's important for it to be a tool that farmers can use when they need to use it, not something it's Tuesday, it's time to spray glyphosate, kind of thing, because that's how they believe that we treat some of these things. And there are some farmers that do.
I was going to
But
say that there are, like, there is that producer. There's feedlots that inject everything that comes into that feedlot with antibiotics. Like,
yep,
it's dishonesty to say that it doesn't happen, but it's also dishonest to say that everybody in the industry does
yep.
it.
And it's just, and that's when I meet with these people and I talk to our customers and I explain that to them. Well, and that's part of our tour. Hey, right over there is a shuttle of glyphosate. Don't make eye contact with it if you're afraid of it. It won't attack you. But we've used it since 1984. This is how we use it. This is why we use it. And once they understand that, and I literally had a guy tell me this at an event that was not for farmers. He's like, he started the conversation with, well, you don't use that evil glyphosate. And I said, yes, we do. And this is how we use it. And at the end of the conversation, he said, well, it's okay for you to use glyphosate, but the rest of farmers can't. So it's that education aspect is why we started. And I told Barb that I'd love to be able to sell direct to the public. And she goes, well, why don't you? And it's because I don't know shit about marketing. And
As she said, hold my beer. I have a degree in marketing.
exactly. She's like, well, why not? Well, I don't know packaging. Well, within a day, she had sent me a bunch of different options on packaging. Well, I don't know about what the rules are. Well, there's the Colorado Cottage Food Act, and here's the rules. And it was just that step by step, that piece by piece, that got us to where we are. And that's essentially the marketing workbook that we're putting together, is kind of how we did it. And when she said we should do this, I said, that's fine, but you write it and I get to edit it. Because I guarantee you, if it has any business feel at all to it, farmers are not going to want to be anywhere close to it. Because farmers don't view their farm as a business. It is a business, but it also is much different than a business. It has similarities, but the differences really set us apart. And so it's written by someone who's business minded, but edited by someone who's a farmer who can recognize that we don't want to use these terms because farmers don't even know what it means. And so let's create this so other people can do the same thing that we did, so other people can think about direct marketing to consumers or specialty crop marketing, or how do you cold call a company that you've never raised that crop before, but you call them up and say, hey, I want to raise buckwheat for your malting company. How much do you use? How much are you looking for? And it's our buckwheat goes to a gluten-free malting company that they now buy our millet, they buy part of our corn, they buy part of our oats. They're interested in part of the rice. For them, that first year we raised buckwheat was really a test in the faith of farmers, that can farmers raise a crop that they don't know. And I was upfront with them, and they came out to the field. They actually helped us source seed for the first time because they were looking for a particular variety. But we've developed a relationship now that when they do their strategic planning, the owner calls me and says, well, this is how much we're going to need. What are you going to have? What are you thinking about for acres on buckwheat, on millet, on this, on that? Do you know another farmer that raises these crops that we can work with? And that terrifies the hell out of my father, that I'm going to introduce them to somebody who's going to price us out of the market. And my response is, well, if they price us out of the market, we'll go find another market. I found one. Why can't I find another? Are you saying that is the only market for buckwheat? And then part of it also is we've shown that we have the dedication to quality that other farmers haven't reached at yet. I mean, we own 5 different seed cleaners. Dad passed up one at an auction. I was really disappointed because, you know, it seems like our farm is where old seed cleaners come to retire.
With 14 crops of different stuff, you probably need all manner of different seed cleaners.
Yeah, and part of it is volume. You know, we have one about the size of a copy machine, one of the big office copy machines. It's a Clipper 2B. It was manufactured probably 70 years ago. Um, does a beautiful job, and it's great if you have a bucket of beans that you need to clean for the consumer. But if you need a semi-load of buckwheat, well, then you pull out the 248 BDH clipper that was manufactured in 1969, that is one of the most beautiful pieces of equipment that you've ever seen, because it's an oak frame with all wood. It's a beautiful piece of engineering. It looks steampunk because it's got the pulleys on the outside. There's no safety shielding on it. That's been that back when either you pay attention or you lose a finger, was the common safety practice. Um, and you know, I've had to learn how to use that machine. But now when I deliver buckwheat, um, the owners told us that the quality that we deliver, they had never seen before. We have that dedication to making sure it is as clean as possible. And there's been times where they'll call us up and be like, hey, we're seeing a little bit too, you know, more of sticks in there than what we are wanting. Okay, let me see what I can do. I swap out screens. I contact QC Screens back east, because they do an awesome job of helping us build the best screen sets that we can. You know, I reach out to my resources and I tweak things. And the next semi load that goes up, they call us up and be like, you got it taken care of. We appreciate it. And they're also open-minded enough that, you know, we've started doing some intercropping stuff and companion cropping. Believe it or not, it's actually to help our bees more than it is to help the crop. Well, the crop is helped by the bees. So in a roundabout way, we have sunflowers growing in our buckwheat fields. So sometimes one of those sunflower seeds will make it through the cleaner. And she's like, okay, now why is there a sunflower seed in there? Well, that is the companion crop that helps the bees navigate these huge fields. Think about the size of a bee. It doesn't want to fly across a quarter section. But if there's landmarks that it can navigate by, well, then it will.
Or rest stop
So,
or stopping point.
exactly. And it's another thing that blooms that it can get nectar from. Um, mind you, we're looking at going out and terminating that sunflowers with our electroweeder, because then we can do this without using chemicals, and we can stop that sunflower at a development point where it's actually put more into the soil than it's taken out of the soil. So it actually is boosting our soil health when we stop that before it goes into flower. But we've developed these relationships, and now we have that reputation where companies call us looking for 300 metric tons of buckwheat, because of the work that we've done. And there is somebody looking for 300 metric tons of buckwheat right now. I guarantee you, if somebody has good quality buckwheat, I could have it sold for them within one phone call. Actually, I would even tell them who to call, because there's companies that are looking for that on a regular basis. And that's why I'm now working with the company to help develop a group of farmers that raise things with regenerative practices, so that company can go to food companies and say, what do you want? We have a group that can raise whatever you need with these practices. You just need to tell us what you want. And that way we bring the abundance back to rural America. It's all freaking tied together. I mean, it's really simple in the long run, but there's a lot of work to be done, and we do it step by step. Barb's doing her part, helping with the marketing thing, riding me to sit down and get the book written about what is regenerative agriculture, because that story needs to be told to the American public so they know why. If there's a sticker on their product that says regenerative, or, you know, the Colorado Department of Ag is developing a sticker that with the number of stars of this product came from this field that is using practices that it's a 3-star field, or it's a 4-star field, or if you're lucky, a 5-star field, which is really hard to do. Well, they say it's hard to do.
You did
I
it.
kind of nailed it first year out. They called me up and they're like, nobody is supposed to get 5-star. And I'm like, oops, sorry. But it's possible, and using these practices, people can do it. And I just want to share that with other people, that they can change their operation and they can regenerate the farmer as they regenerate the land. Because as you, I'm sure, have experienced, when you go to these farm conferences, you run into the guys that have gone regenerative, and they have an energy and a passion that you don't see in the row crop commodity farmer. They're excited about agriculture and the opportunities.
I talked, I can't remember who I talked to at Soil Health U a couple of weeks ago about this very thing. Like, it was somebody that's been to several other conferences, like outside of regenerative ag, outside of, you know, the stuff that you and I like to do and talk about, you know, some of the more mainstream conferences. I think NCBA, CattleCon was one of them that they'd been to, and you know, some of the larger like crop type conferences. And I asked them, the question I had for this person was, what's the atmosphere like when you go to one of these things that's not regenerative ag? You know, what are the producers like? I said, do they have any hope, or are they all depressed? I said, well, the few producers that do show up at those things, they're depressed. They're depressed. They don't have that great of an outlook on life. They're, you know, they're the Kool-Aid drinkers. And the difference is the people that you see at the regenerative ag conferences, like Brother Gail Fuller that we mentioned, my friend Macaulay Kincaid, our mutual friend Jay Young. Like, these are all, well, except Gail. Gail's old as shit. But the other couple, you know, they're younger folks, and they've got a lot of energy, they've got a lot of passion, and they've got a lot of hope. And they're excited about what they're doing because they're not doing the mainstream. They're doing new stuff that works. And that's why I love talking to you, Roy, and hearing about what you have going on your farm. And I wish we had more time today. I've got to get out of here and get moving. I'm actually a few minutes overdue already. And, you know, there's so much stuff we didn't even talk about. We didn't even talk about, you know, about companion and cover crops for bees or intercrop strips. We barely even talked about your bees at all. I'm sitting here for the last 2 hours looking at you, and you've got, I don't know, what is it, probably 30 beehives behind you in your background?
We have 25 is kind of the max that we try to run, and hopefully they'll make it through this winter.
That's a lot of bees. Well, hopefully we can come back and do another one of these real soon. Talk about your bees and talk about getting into some more of Roy's marketing tips and how to develop markets. And I'm looking forward to reading that book when it comes out.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll make sure you get a copy.
All right. Where would you like to send folks to?
The farm's website is pfzfarms.com. That's Paul Frank Zebra. That's the joy of having a last name Pfaltzgraff. Nobody can spell it or pronounce it. And I'm on Twitter at pfzfarms.com, or you can search PFZ or Pfaltzgraff Farms on YouTube to see some of our videos. We're on Instagram. I don't do a lot with that, or Facebook. And my big thing is LinkedIn, and Twitter is where I spend most of my time.
I've got to put more time into LinkedIn. I just started working on that.
It has a surprisingly large ag community. I've really been impressed with how that section has grown in the last year.
Yeah, for sure. I've lurked on LinkedIn for a long time, and it just seems like the last few months, things about ag, and especially about regenerative ag, are really starting to take off on LinkedIn. So I got to start putting some more time in there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great free thing.
All right, Roy, I really appreciate your time this morning. It's been a lot of fun. We'll have to do it again sometime.
Absolutely. You just let me know.
All right, we'll do. You got any parting words, closing thoughts?
know where your food comes from.
I like it. I like it. Shake the hand that feeds you.
Yep.
All right. Well, I guess we'll let everybody go get on with your week. Get out there, kill the week. Have a good one. See you guys.